In the harsh Wyoming territory of 1887, some wounds run deeper than the winter frost. Nora Wren had committed the unforgivable sin in the eyes of her husband's family. She couldn't bear children. In a settlement where a woman's worth was measured by the sons she produced, being barren was worse than being dead. So they made sure she was both. Under the pretense of taking her to visit distant relatives, her brother-in-law led her into the desert and buried her alive, leaving only a crude wooden cross to mark where the cursed woman lay. But death had no claim on Nora that day. Miles from town, Elias Boone spotted circling buzzards and rode out expecting to find a dead animal. Instead, he discovered a woman clawing her way out of her own grave, dirt still caked in her hair, eyes blazing with a fury that could melt snow. What happens when two people the world has thrown away find each other in the wilderness? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning sun cast long shadows across the Boone homestead, painting the weathered timber and sagging fence posts in shades of amber and gold. Elias Boone stood on his front porch, coffee cup warming his calloused hands, watching his 8-year-old daughter Lucy chase their aging rooster around the chicken coop. Her laughter carried on the crisp autumn air, a sound that had become precious since her mother's passing 3 winters ago. The ranch wasn't much to look at. 40 acres of stubborn Wyoming soil that yielded more rocks than crops. A handful of cattle that seemed determined to wander off at every opportunity, and a house that groaned with each prairie wind. But it was theirs, earned through sweat and stubbornness, and it held memories of better times when Sarah's voice had filled the rooms with singing and the scent of her bread had made the place feel like home. Elias set down his cup and walked toward the barn, his boots crunching on the frost-kissed grass. At 32, he carried himself with the measured gait of a man who'd learned that life could change in an instant. His face bore the weathered lines of someone who'd spent years squinting into the sun and wind, but his dark eyes still held warmth when they settled on his daughter. "Papa, Hercules won't stay put," Lucy called out, using the grandiose name she'd given their temperamental rooster. The bird had escaped the coop again and was strutting around the yard with the air of a general inspecting his troops. "That old bird's got more sense than we do," Elias replied, a smile tugging at the corner of his mouth. "He knows winter's coming, and he's making the most of these last warm days." Lucy giggled and made another grab for Hercules, who dodged her with practiced ease. At 8 years old, she was all knees and elbows, her blonde hair perpetually escaping, whatever attempt Elias made to braid it each morning. She had her mother's cornflower blue eyes and her father's stubborn chin, a combination that meant she could charm her way out of trouble almost as quickly as she could find it. The nearest town, Millfield, lay 15 miles to the east, close, enough to ride in for supplies, but far enough away that the Boones rarely saw neighbors unless someone was in genuine need. It was a small community of perhaps 200 souls, built around a general store, a church, and the kind of unspoken rules that governed frontier life. A man's word was his bond, a woman's place was clearly defined, and those who didn't fit, the expected mold, often found themselves on the outside looking in. Elias had always been something of an outsider himself. He'd arrived in Wyoming 7 years ago with Sarah and baby Lucy, carrying little more than determination and a small inheritance from his father's farm back in Kansas. Unlike many of the settlers who'd come west seeking fortune, Elias had come seeking peace, a place where a man could work his land, raise his family, and find contentment in simple things. Sarah had understood that desire. She'd been the daughter of a traveling preacher, raised to find grace in humble circumstances and strength in quiet faith. When they'd met at a church social in Kansas, she'd seen past his reserved nature to the gentleness beneath. Their courtship had been brief but deep, built on shared values and the recognition that they both sought something more enduring than passion. They wanted partnership. The first few years in Wyoming had been everything they'd hoped for. The land was challenging but fair, responding to hard work with modest yields. Sarah had thrown herself into making their house a home, tending a garden that somehow flourished despite the harsh conditions, and filling their evenings with stories and songs that made the isolation feel like intimacy rather than loneliness. Then came the fever. It had started with the livestock, a strange illness that swept through several ranches in the area. Taking cattle and horses without warning, Dr. Whitman from town had assured everyone that it posed no threat to humans, but he'd been wrong. Sarah had been helping a neighbor tend to sick animals when she'd been exposed. Within a week, she was burning with fever. Within 2 weeks, she was gone. Elias had buried his wife on a small rise behind their house, where she could overlook the valley she'd loved. He'd carved her headstone himself, working late into the night by lamplight, because he couldn't bear the thought of anyone else's hands shaping the words that would mark her resting place. The inscription was simple. Sarah Boone, beloved wife and mother. She made all things beautiful. The months that followed had been the darkest of Elias's life. Grief sat on his chest like a stone, making even simple tasks feel monumental. If not for Lucy's needs, he might have let the ranch go to ruin. But his daughter required care, attention, and as much normalcy as he could provide. So he'd learned to braid her hair with clumsy fingers, to mend her torn dresses with inexpert stitches, and to tell bedtime stories that wouldn't make her cry for her mama. Slowly, they'd found their rhythm. Elias discovered he had a talent for raising cattle, understanding their needs and temperaments in a way that made his small herd surprisingly productive. Lucy proved to be a natural with the chickens and had taken over the care of their vegetable garden with the same dedication her mother had shown. They weren't thriving exactly, but they were surviving, and some days that felt like victory enough. The townspeople of Millfield had shown kindness in their own way. Mrs. Garrett, the pastor's wife, had brought meals during those first terrible months. Old Henrik at the general store had extended credit when money was tight. The other ranchers had shared knowledge and occasionally lent hands during roundup season. But there was always an undercurrent of concern about Elias raising a daughter alone. Whispers about whether a man could properly guide a girl through the complexities of growing up. More than once, well-meaning neighbors had suggested that Lucy might be better off with a family that included a mother figure. The hints had grown more pointed as Lucy had gotten older, and Elias knew that some in town questioned whether he was doing right by his daughter. The pressure to remarry wasn't spoken aloud, but it hung in the air during Sunday services and social gatherings like smoke from a poorly tended fire. Elias understood their concerns, but he also knew that Lucy was happy. She was bright, curious, and confident in ways that suggested she was getting what she needed from their unconventional arrangement. Still, he couldn't shake the feeling that their little family was seen as incomplete, that they were living on borrowed time before someone decided to intervene for Lucy's own good. The irony wasn't lost on him that in a place where individual freedom was supposed to be paramount, conformity was often the price of acceptance. He'd seen it happen to others. The bachelor who drank too much and found himself unwelcome at community gatherings, the widow who refused to remarry and slowly became invisible to her neighbors, the family whose religious beliefs differed slightly from the norm and who gradually found themselves isolated. As he mucked out the stalls that morning, Elias reflected on how thin the line was between belonging and being cast out. In Kansas, his family had been part of an established community with deep roots and long memories. Here, relationships were newer, more fragile, built on immediate utility rather than generational trust. A man could go from respected neighbor to unwelcome stranger based on a single misstep or misunderstanding. The sound of hoofbeats interrupted his thoughts. Elias looked up to see Pastor Garrett approaching on his bay mare, a sight that usually meant someone in the community needed help or there was church business to discuss. The pastor was a good man, sincere in his faith and genuine in his care for his flock, but his visits often came with complications. "Morning, Elias," the pastor called out as he dismounted. "Beautiful day the Lord's given us." "That it is," Elias replied, setting aside his pitchfork. "What brings you out this way, Pastor?" Pastor Garrett's expression grew somber. "I'm afraid I have some difficult news to share about Nora Wren." Elias knew the name, but not the woman. The Wrens lived closer to town, and he'd heard mention of them in passing, but had never had occasion to interact with the family directly. From what little he'd gleaned, they were recent arrivals who'd struggled to establish themselves in the community. "She's passed away," the pastor continued. "Her brother-in-law came to me yesterday, said she'd taken ill while visiting relatives up north. They buried her out there, couldn't bring the body back given the distance and the heat. The news settled heavily in the morning air. Death was a constant companion on the frontier, always lurking around the edges of daily life, but it never failed to remind everyone of their own mortality and the fragility of their carefully constructed existences." "I'm sorry to hear it," Elias said quietly. "She was young, wasn't she?" "Too young," Pastor Garrett agreed. 26 years old, married. "Only 3 years. It's a tragedy made worse by—" He paused, seeming to choose his words carefully. "Well, there had been talk in town about her situation. She and her husband hadn't been blessed with children, and some folks had begun to whisper about whether that was natural or otherwise." Elias felt a familiar knot form in his stomach. He'd heard this kind of talk before, the way communities sometimes turned on those who didn't fit expected patterns. The suggestion that a woman's inability to bear children might be a sign of moral failing or divine disfavor was both cruel and common. A way for others to feel secure in their own circumstances by casting judgment on someone else's perceived shortcomings. "That's a hard burden for anyone to carry," Elias said carefully. "Indeed it is. I tried to counsel the congregation about showing Christian charity, but you know how these things go. People are frightened by what they don't understand, and they sometimes mistake their fear for righteousness." The pastor's voice carried genuine regret. "I keep thinking there might have been something more I could have done, some way to make her feel more welcome in our community." They stood in comfortable silence for a moment, two men who understood the weight of responsibility that came with caring for others, whether as parent or pastor. Finally, Pastor Garrett cleared his throat. "There is one other matter I wanted to discuss with you, Elias. It concerns Lucy." "Here it comes," Elias thought, bracing himself for another well-intentioned suggestion about his daughter's need for feminine guidance. "Mrs. Henderson has volunteered to take on additional pupils for winter schooling, and she specifically mentioned that Lucy might benefit from spending more time with other children her age, particularly the girls. It would give her opportunities to learn skills that—" He trailed off, apparently recognizing the delicate nature of what he was suggesting. "Skills that a father can't teach her," Elias finished. "I didn't mean to imply—" "It's all right, Pastor. I know you mean well, and I appreciate your concern for Lucy's development, but she's learning what she needs to learn, and she's happy where she is." Pastor Garrett nodded slowly, but Elias could see that the conversation wasn't entirely finished. There would be other visits, other suggestions, other gentle pressures to conform to what the community deemed appropriate. It was the price of living among people who meant well, but couldn't understand that different didn't necessarily mean deficient. After the pastor left, Elias found himself thinking about Nora Wren, a woman he'd never met, but whose story resonated with his own sense of being perpetually on the outside. She'd been judged for her inability to fulfill society's expectations, just as he was constantly evaluated on his fitness to raise a daughter alone. The difference was that her judgment had followed her to the grave, while his was still evolving. He looked across the yard to where Lucy was finally coaxing Hercules back into the coop, her patience and gentleness succeeding where force had failed. She caught his eye and waved, her smile bright enough to chase away the shadows that had settled over his thoughts. Whatever challenges lay ahead, whatever pressures came from well-meaning neighbors, he had something precious to protect and a life worth defending. The morning was warming now, promising a fine day for the work that never ended on a ranch. There were fences to mend, animals to tend, and 100 small tasks that would keep him busy until the sunset. It was a good life, even if it was an unconventional one, and he was grateful for it. In the distance, a hawk circled high above the prairie, riding the thermals with effortless grace. Elias watched it for a moment, admiring the bird's ability to see the entire landscape from its lofty perspective. From up there, the divisions between properties, the boundaries that separated one family's struggles from another's, would be invisible. There would be only the vast expanse of land and sky, beautiful and indifferent to the small dramas playing out below. As he turned back toward the barn, something glinted in the dirt near his feet. He bent down and picked up a thin gold band, tarnished and twisted, with dirt still clinging to its surface. It must have been dropped by someone passing through, though he couldn't imagine when or by whom. The ring was clearly a woman's, delicate and worn, with an inscription inside that was too scratched to read clearly. He held it up to the light, studying the craftsmanship that spoke of better times and cherished moments. Someone had worn this ring with love, had treasured it as a symbol of promises made and hopes shared. Now it lay abandoned in his yard, separated from its owner by circumstances he could only imagine. Elias slipped the ring into his pocket, thinking he'd ask around town to see if anyone had lost it. It seemed important somehow, this small piece of someone's life that had found its way to his doorstep. In a world where so much was thrown away or discarded, where people like Nora Wren could be dismissed and forgotten, preserving something precious felt like a small act of defiance against the carelessness of fate. 3 days after Pastor Garrett's visit, Elias noticed the buzzards. They circled high above a stretch of scrubland about 2 miles northeast of his property, their lazy spirals cutting dark shapes against the pale October sky. At first, he'd dismissed them. Death was common enough on the prairie, and carrion birds were simply part of nature's way of cleaning up. But as the morning wore on, their persistence nagged at him. The birds weren't descending to feed, which suggested whatever had drawn them was either too large to approach safely or not quite ready for their attention. "Papa, what are those big birds doing?" Lucy asked, joining him on the porch where he'd been watching the distant spectacle. "Just nature taking its course, little one," he replied, though something in his gut told him it might be more complicated than that. Probably found a deer or elk that didn't make it through the night. But even as he said it, doubt crept in. The location bothered him. That particular stretch of land was barren except for scrub brush and scattered rocks, not the kind of place where large game typically wandered. And there was something about the birds' behavior that seemed different, more agitated than the methodical patience he usually associated with their kind. By midday, his unease had grown strong enough to override his practical nature. He saddled his horse, a sturdy bay gelding named Winchester, and told Lucy he'd be back before supper. She waved him off with the casual confidence of a child who'd never known her father to encounter anything he couldn't handle. The ride across the prairie took him through familiar territory, rolling grassland, broken by occasional draws, and the meandering line of cottonwoods that marked seasonal streams. The October air carried the scent of curing grass and the promise of winter, crisp enough to make Winchester snort and prance despite his years. It was the kind of day that usually filled Elias with quiet contentment, but the circling buzzards had cast a shadow over his mood. As he drew closer to the site, the landscape began to change subtly. The grass grew sparser, replaced by harder ground, scattered with small stones and the occasional patch of prickly pear cactus. This was marginal land, the kind that supported little life and attracted even less attention, which made it all the more puzzling that something had died here in a way dramatic enough to draw scavengers from miles around. The buzzards noticed his approach and rose higher, their calls carrying a harsh note of displeasure at being disturbed. Winchester's ears twitched forward nervously, and Elias could feel the horse's reluctance to continue. Animals often sensed things that humans missed, and he'd learned to pay attention to such warnings. He dismounted about 50 yards from what appeared to be the focus of the bird's attention, a low mound of earth that looked suspiciously regular for something natural. As he walked closer, leading Winchester by the reins, details began to resolve that made his chest tighten with growing alarm. Someone had been digging here recently. The earth was disturbed in a roughly rectangular pattern with a small wooden cross stuck into the ground at one end. But most disturbing of all, the mound was moving, not with the steady heave of an animal trapped beneath, but with the desperate clawing motion of something trying to escape. Elias dropped Winchester's reins and ran the last 20 yards, his boots slipping on the loose dirt as he reached the edge of what was clearly a grave. The sounds coming from below were unmistakably human, gasping, sobbing, and the frantic scraping of fingernails against packed earth. "Hold on!" he shouted, falling to his knees and beginning to dig with his bare hands. "I'm here to help!" The response was immediate, a muffled cry that spoke of desperate hope mixed with exhaustion. Whoever was down there had been fighting for their life, and from the state of the dirt around the edges, they'd been doing it for some time. Elias dug with the fury of a man who understood that every second mattered. The earth was loose enough to move quickly, but there was a shocking amount of it. Someone had put considerable effort into making this burial look permanent. As he worked, he called out reassurances, though he wasn't sure how much could be heard through the remaining dirt. "Almost there. Keep fighting." His hands bled from rocks and root fragments, but he didn't slow down. Years of ranch work had given him the strength and endurance for sustained physical effort, and he drew on every ounce of it now. The October sun beat down on his back, soaking his shirt with sweat despite the cool air. Then his fingers struck fabric, and a moment later, a hand broke through the surface, pale, dirt-caked, but undeniably alive. He grasped it firmly and pulled, helping to clear the remaining earth from around a woman's face and shoulders. She emerged, like something from a nightmare, gasping and choking, her dark hair matted with dirt and her dress torn and filthy. But her eyes, even wide with terror and exhaustion, blazed with a fierce determination that spoke of an unbreakable will to survive. "Easy now," Elias said gently, helping her sit up as she continued to cough and spit dirt from her mouth. "You're safe. You're alive." She looked at him with such intensity that he felt pinned in place, as if she were trying to determine whether he was real or another cruel hallucination born of desperation. When she finally spoke, her voice was hoarse and raw, but clear. They said I was dead." "Well, they were wrong," Elias replied, pulling his handkerchief from his pocket and offering it to her. The white cloth was soon stained with dirt and blood as she pressed it to a cut on her forehead. "Can you tell me your name?" "Nora," she whispered, then stronger. "Nora Wren." The name hit him like a physical blow. This was the woman Pastor Garrett had said was dead and buried up north. This was the woman whose supposed death had been accepted without question, whose absence had been explained away with a story that now revealed itself as a monstrous lie. "Mrs. Wren," he said carefully, "there are people in town who believe you died of illness while visiting relatives." A bitter laugh escaped her, turning into another coughing fit. "Is that what they told them? How convenient." She struggled to get her legs free from the remaining dirt, and Elias helped her, noting the rope burns around her ankles that told a story of being bound before burial. "Who did this to you?" Her expression hardened, and for a moment he saw past the victim to the survivor beneath. "My husband's brother, Thomas, along with his sons." She accepted Elias's help in standing, though she swayed dangerously. "Said I were cursed, barren and worthless, a burden on the family name." The casual cruelty of it took Elias's breath away. He'd known that frontier justice could be harsh, that communities sometimes handled problems in ways that would seem barbaric to more civilized society. But this went beyond rough justice into pure evil, the cold-blooded attempted murder of a woman whose only crime was failing to bear children. "How long have you been down there?" "I don't know," she admitted, pressing the bloodied handkerchief to her temple again. "Days, maybe. I lost track after the first night." She looked around with growing panic, as if expecting her attackers to materialize from the scrubland. "They'll come back to check. They'll want to make sure I'm really dead. This time." "No, they won't," Elias said firmly, "because you're coming with me." She stared at him with suspicion and hope warring in her expression. "You don't understand. If they find out you helped me, if they discover I'm still alive, then we'll deal with that when it happens." He moved to help steady her as another wave of dizziness hit. "Right now you need food, water, and medical attention. My ranch isn't far, and my daughter Lucy will be glad for the company." "I can't ask you to—" "You're not asking. I'm offering." He guided her toward Winchester, who had remained remarkably calm despite the extraordinary circumstances. "Besides, what kind of man would I be if I left you out here after what you've been through?" The question seemed to unlock something in her, and for the first time since emerging from the grave, tears began to flow down her dirt-stained cheeks. Not the desperate sobbing of panic, but the quiet weeping of someone who had given up hope of human kindness and found it in the most unlikely place. Getting her mounted proved challenging. Her ordeal had left her weak and shaky, and the simple act of climbing onto Winchester's back seemed to exhaust her remaining reserves. Elias ended up lifting her bodily into the saddle, then swinging up behind her to provide support for the ride back. As they left the burial site behind, Nora turned for one last look at the wooden cross that had marked her supposed grave. "They carved my name into it," she said quietly. "Thomas spent time making it look proper, like he actually cared." Elias followed her gaze to the crude marker, now standing sentinel over an empty hole. The inscription was simple, but damning. "Nora, Wren taken by fever." It was a monument to a lie, a prop in an elaborate performance designed to cover up murder. "We should leave it," Nora said, reading his thoughts. "If they come back and find it gone, they'll know someone was here." It went against every instinct Elias had to leave evidence of such evil standing in place, but he recognized the wisdom. In her words, "For now, survival trumped justice. There would be time later to set the record straight." The ride back to the ranch passed in relative silence, with Nora leaning heavily against his chest and occasionally drifting into an exhausted doze. Elias found himself hyper-aware of her presence, the weight of her body against his, the faint scent of her hair beneath the dirt and fear, the steady rhythm of her breathing that proved she was truly alive despite everything that had been done. To her, he'd saved her life, but he was beginning to understand that the rescue was only the beginning. Bringing her to his ranch, taking her into his home, declaring himself her protector, these were not simple acts of Christian charity. In a community where gossip traveled faster than wildfire and deviation from accepted norms could destroy a person's standing, harboring a woman who was supposed to be dead was tantamount to declaring war on the established order. But as he felt, Nora's breathing steady into the natural rhythm of sleep, as he guided Winchester carefully across the familiar prairie toward home, Elias realized he had no choice. Some things were more important than social standing or community acceptance. Some battles were worth fighting regardless of the cost. Behind them, the buzzards had given up their vigil and dispersed to find easier prey. The wooden cross stood alone in the gathering afternoon shadows, marking the spot where someone had tried to erase a human life and failed. It would remain there as a reminder that evil often wore a righteous face, and that sometimes salvation came from the most unexpected sources. The sun was beginning its descent toward the western horizon, painting the grassland in shades of gold and amber. In the distance, smoke rose from the chimney of the Boone homestead, where Lucy would be starting supper and wondering what had kept her father so long. Soon she would meet the woman who had clawed her way back from the dead, and their small family would expand to include someone who had been written off by the world but refused to stay buried. As Winchester's hooves beat a steady rhythm against the prairie ground carrying them home, Elias felt the weight of destiny settling around them like gathering storm clouds. Whatever came next, whatever challenges and conflicts arose from this moment of choice, there would be no turning back. He had pulled Nora Wren from her grave, and in doing so, he had changed the course of all their lives forever. Lucy was waiting on the front porch when they arrived, her small face creased with worry that transformed into wide-eyed amazement as she saw the bedraggled woman riding behind her father. At 8 years old, she possessed the natural curiosity of childhood, tempered by the practical wisdom that came from living on an isolated ranch where visitors were rare and usually brought either good news or trouble. "Papa, who is that lady?" she asked, as Elias dismounted and carefully helped Nora down from Winchester's back. "She looks like she's been playing in the dirt pile behind the barn." Despite everything she'd endured, Nora managed a small smile at the child's innocent observation. "I suppose I do look rather a mess," she said, her voice still hoarse but gaining strength. "Lucy, this is Mrs. Nora Wren," Elias said, his hands remaining supportive at Nora's elbow as she swayed slightly. "She's had some trouble, and she's going to be staying with us for a while." The little girl studied Nora with the frank assessment children were known for, taking in the torn dress, the dirt-caked hair, and the exhaustion written in every line of her posture. But instead of fear or revulsion, Lucy's expression showed only concern and the kind of immediate acceptance that adults rarely managed. "Are you hurt?" Lucy asked. "Papa's real good at fixing things. He fixed my arm when I fell out of the apple tree, and he made Belle feel better when she got that thorn in her paw." "I think I'll be all right," Nora replied, touched by the child's matter-of-fact kindness, "though I could probably use some of that fixing your papa's so good at." Elias felt a warmth in his chest at the easy way they spoke to each other. He'd been worried about how Lucy might react to a stranger in their home, especially one who looked as if she'd been through a traumatic experience. But his daughter seemed to possess an intuitive understanding that this woman needed help, and Lucy had never been one to turn away from someone in need. "Let's get you inside and cleaned up," he said, guiding Nora toward the house. "Lucy, would you put some water on to heat, and maybe see if we have any of that soup your mama used to make in the cold cellar?" As they crossed the threshold into the modest home, Nora paused, overwhelmed by the simple normalcy of the scene. After days of fighting for her life in the suffocating darkness of a makeshift grave, the sight of a well-worn kitchen table, gingham curtains, and the lingering scent of this morning's coffee felt almost surreal. "The washroom is just through." "There," Elias said, indicating a door off the kitchen. "I'll see if I can find some clothes that might fit you. Sarah was about your size, and I've kept—" He trailed off, suddenly uncertain about offering his dead wife's belongings to this stranger. "That's very kind," Nora said quietly, understanding his hesitation. "I don't want to presume on your generosity or disturb memories that should rest in peace." "Mama would want to help," Lucy piped up from where she was coaxing the fire in the stove back to life. "She always said clothes were meant to keep people warm, not gather dust in trunks." The child's simple wisdom settled the matter. Elias disappeared into the bedroom he'd once shared with Sarah, and returned with a clean dress, undergarments, and a shawl that still carried the faint scent of lavender from the sachets his wife had made. The familiar smell brought a sharp pang of loss, but it was tempered by the rightness of seeing her things put to use for someone who desperately needed them. "Take all the time you need," he said, handing the bundle to Nora. "Lucy and I will get some food ready." Alone in the washroom, Nora caught sight of herself in the small mirror above the basin and almost didn't recognize the wild-eyed creature staring back. Her dark hair hung in matted tangles, her face was streaked with dirt and dried blood, and her clothes were torn beyond repair. But it was her eyes that shocked her most. They held a feral quality she'd never seen before, the look of someone who had stared death in the face and clawed their way back to life through sheer force of will. The warm water Elias brought felt like a luxury beyond description. As she washed away the grime and horror of her ordeal, Nora tried to process what had happened to her and what it meant for her future. She was alive when everyone believed her dead, rescued by a man who had no reason to help her, and now sitting in a kitchen that felt more like home than any place she'd lived in the past 3 years. Her marriage to Henry Wren had been arranged, more than chosen, a practical union between two families looking to combine resources and establish stronger footing in the territory. Henry had been kind enough, if distant, and she'd tried to be a good wife, despite the growing pressure from his family about her failure to conceive. When Henry died in a farming accident 6 months ago, she'd expected to return to her own family. But Thomas Wren had made it clear that she was his responsibility now, and his burden. The pressure had intensified after the funeral. Thomas's wife, Martha, had made pointed comments about the money spent feeding someone who wasn't contributing to the family's future. The whispers in town had grown louder, with some suggesting that Nora's barrenness was a sign of divine displeasure. When Pastor Garrett had tried to counsel patience and Christian charity, Thomas had nodded piously in public, while making it clear in private that solutions needed to be found. The solution had come in the form of a fabricated visit to distant relatives. Thomas had convinced the community that Nora needed to spend time with family up north, perhaps to find a new husband, or at least remove the reminder of the Wren family's childless branch. Only she had never made it to any relatives. Instead, she'd been taken to that desolate stretch of scrubland, tied hand and foot, and buried alive with only Thomas's final words echoing in her ears. The Lord helps those who help themselves, and this family helps itself by removing curses. But now, as she slipped into Sarah Boone's dress, a simple blue calico that fit remarkably well, Nora felt something she hadn't experienced in months: safety. The fabric was soft from many washings, and the shawl wrapped around her shoulders, like an embrace from a woman she'd never met, but already felt grateful to. When she emerged from the washroom, she found Lucy setting the table with careful precision, while Elias ladled soup into bowls. The scene was so domestic, so normal, that it brought tears to her eyes. How long had it been since she'd sat at a table where she was welcome, where her presence wasn't viewed as a burden or a problem to be solved? "You look much better," Elias said, and she caught something in his voice that made her look at him more closely. There was an appreciation there that went beyond simple relief at her improved appearance, a warmth that made her suddenly conscious of how the borrowed dress fit her figure. "Your wife had excellent taste," Nora replied, smoothing the skirt self-consciously. "I feel almost human again." "You always were human," Lucy said with the matter-of-fact wisdom that seemed to be her specialty. "You just had a lot of dirt on top of the human part." They sat down to the simple meal of soup and bread, and for a few minutes the only sounds were spoons against bowls and the occasional crackle from the fire. But as the immediate needs of hunger and cleanliness were met, the larger questions began to assert themselves. "Mrs. Wren," Elias began carefully, then stopped. "I'm sorry, what should I call you?" "Given the circumstances, Nora," she said simply. "I think formality seems rather pointless after you've literally dug me out of a grave." "Nora, then." He set down his spoon and looked at her directly. "We need to talk about what happens next. You can't go back to town, obviously. And if Thomas Wren thinks you're dead, he's going to want to keep it that way." "I know." She wrapped the shawl tighter around her shoulders, seeking comfort in its warmth. "I've been thinking about it while I was washing up. If he finds out I survived, he'll just try again, and next time he'll make sure there are no mistakes." "Then we need to make sure he doesn't find out," Lucy said, with the confidence of someone who hadn't yet learned that some problems didn't have simple solutions. Both adults looked at the child, struck by her immediate assumption that they were all in this together. For Lucy, it seemed perfectly natural that they would protect Nora, that their family unit would expand to include this woman who had literally risen from the dead. "It's not that simple, little one," Elias said gently. "People in town know Nora. If she's seen, then she won't be seen," Lucy replied with unshakable logic. "She can stay here with us. We don't go to town very much anyway, and there's plenty of work to do around the ranch." Nora felt her heart constrict at the child's easy acceptance. The assumption that of course they would want her to stay, that of course she belonged here. It was the kind of unconditional welcome she'd never experienced, even in her own family. "Lucy's right about one thing," Elias said slowly. "This ranch is isolated enough that you could stay hidden, at least for a while. But there are complications we need to consider, such as, people will ask questions if I suddenly have help around the place. If someone spots you, even from a distance, word will get back to town. And then there's the matter of supplies. I'll need to buy more food, more of certain items, and Mrs. Henderson at the general store has a sharp eye for patterns." Nora nodded, understanding the delicate web of small-town observation that could trap the unwary. "You're taking a considerable risk just by helping me. If they discover what you've done, then we'll face that when it comes," Elias said firmly. "But I won't turn you out to save myself trouble. What kind of man would that make me?" The words hung in the air between them, carrying more weight than simple hospitality. In offering her sanctuary, he was making a choice that went beyond Christian charity into something more personal, more dangerous. And in accepting, she would be placing her life in his hands as surely as if he'd never pulled her from that grave. "There's something else," Nora said quietly, knowing she had to be completely honest about the dangers. "Thomas didn't act alone. He has support from others in town, people who believed his story about me being cursed. If they think that curse might spread—" "Superstitious nonsense," Elias said, but she could see the concern in his eyes. "Maybe, but superstitious nonsense has killed people before, and it can destroy reputations just as easily." She looked around the comfortable kitchen at Lucy's innocent face and Elias's determined expression. "You have a life here, a position in the community. I can't ask you to risk that for me." "You're not asking," he replied, echoing his words. "And from earlier, I'm choosing." As if to emphasize the point, he stood and walked to an old trunk in the corner of the room. From it, he withdrew a heavy woolen shawl, one that had clearly been well loved and carefully maintained. The fabric was a deep blue-gray, the color of storm clouds, and it was edged with intricate embroidery that spoke of patient hours and skilled hands. "This was Sarah's," he said, bringing it to Nora. "She wore it every evening when she sat by the fire, working on her sewing or reading to Lucy. I think she'd want you to have it." Nora accepted the shawl with trembling hands, understanding the significance of the gesture. This wasn't just clothing, it was acceptance, a symbol of belonging, a bridge between the woman who had made this house a home and the woman who now needed shelter within its walls. "Thank you," she whispered, wrapping the shawl around her shoulders. It was warm and soft, and it carried the faint scent of lavender and wood smoke that seemed to embody the essence of peaceful domesticity. "Does this mean Nora is going to stay?" Lucy asked, looking between the two adults with hopeful eyes. "For now," Elias said, and Nora heard the unspoken promise in his words. "For as long as you need, for as long as it's safe, for as long as we can make it work." As evening settled over the ranch, they fell into an easy routine of clearing dishes and preparing for the night. Lucy chatted about her lessons and her chickens, treating Nora's presence as if it were the most natural thing in the world. Elias moved with quiet efficiency, banking the fire and checking the locks with the automatic gestures of a man who'd learned to secure his home against an unpredictable world. But underneath the domestic normalcy, all three of them understood that everything had changed. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new risks, and new questions about how long they could maintain the fiction that Nora Wren was safely dead and buried. For tonight, though, they had warmth, safety, and the fragile, beginning of something that might, with care and luck, grow into the family none of them had expected to find. The first week passed in a careful dance of adjustment and discovery. Nora proved to be a natural addition to the household routines, falling into the rhythm of ranch life with an ease that surprised all of them. She rose before dawn to help with the morning chores, worked alongside Elias in comfortable silence, and spent afternoons teaching Lucy the finer points of needlework and cooking that her father, for all his competence, couldn't provide. It was during one of these afternoon lessons that Lucy produced her most treasured possession, a wooden doll her father had carved for her 5th birthday. The figure was simple but lovingly crafted, with careful attention to details like tiny fingers and a face that managed to convey both strength and gentleness. Lucy had named her Martha after her grandmother back in Kansas, and she'd been the child's constant companion through the dark months following her mother's death. "Papa made her when I was sad about Mama dying," Lucy explained, settling the doll in Nora's hands with the solemnity of someone sharing something precious. "He said Martha would help keep the loneliness away." Nora examined the doll with genuine appreciation, noting the smooth finish that spoke of hours spent sanding away rough edges, the tiny dress sewn from scraps of good fabric, and the painted features that somehow captured an expression of patient kindness. "She's beautiful, Lucy, and she looks very wise." "She is," Lucy agreed seriously. "She helps me remember that Mama's still watching over us, even if we can't see her anymore." The simple faith in the child's words brought tears to Nora's eyes. Here was a little girl who had lost her mother at an age when such security was most precious, yet she'd managed to hold on to hope and trust in the goodness of the world. It was a resilience that put Nora's own struggles into perspective. "Would you like to hold her while we work on your stitches?" Lucy asked, apparently sensing that the doll might provide comfort to this grown woman who sometimes got a far away. "Look in her eyes." "I'd be honored," Nora replied, cradling the wooden figure as Lucy settled beside her with her embroidery hoop. As the days passed, Nora found herself sharing more of her own story, though she was careful to soften the harsher details for Lucy's young ears. She spoke of her marriage to Henry, focusing on the quiet moments of companionship rather than the growing pressure from his family. She described her love of reading and her skill with a needle, her attempts to make a garden grow in inhospitable soil, and her dreams of children who had never come. "Henry was a good man," she told Elias one evening as they sat by the fire after Lucy had gone to bed. "But he was caught between his own kindness and his family's expectations. When the years passed and I didn't conceive, he started pulling away. Not because he blamed me, but because he didn't know how to protect me from their disappointment." Elias nodded, understanding the impossible position her husband had been in. "It's hard when the people you love want different things than what life gives you." "Yes," Nora agreed, her fingers working automatically on the sock she was darning. "I think he felt like he was failing as a husband because he couldn't give his family the heir they wanted. And I felt like I was failing as a woman because I couldn't give him the child he deserved. Did you want children?" The question hung in the air between them, heavy with unspoken implications. Nora was quiet for so long that Elias began to wonder if he'd overstepped, but finally she spoke. "Yes, I did. Very much. But as the years went by, I began to wonder if perhaps God had other plans for me. Maybe my purpose wasn't to be a mother, in the traditional sense." She looked across the room to where Lucy's small shoes sat by the door, waiting for morning. Maybe it was to be something else entirely. Their conversations often took on this quality of careful revelation, each of them sharing pieces of their past while building the foundation of trust necessary for their unusual situation. Elias told her about his early days in Wyoming, the challenges of establishing the ranch, and the slow process of carving out a life in an unforgiving landscape. "Sarah was braver than I was," he admitted during one such evening. "She saw the potential in this place when all I could see were the obstacles. She'd stand on that hill behind the house and describe the gardens she wanted to plant, the improvements we'd make, the life we'd build together. Her faith in our future gave me the courage to keep going when things got difficult. She sounds like a remarkable woman. She was. And she would have liked you, I think. You have the same quality of seeing possibilities where others might see only problems. Nora felt warmth spread through her chest at the comparison. To be thought worthy of such a woman's friendship felt like a gift she hadn't expected. The physical work of ranch life proved to be exactly what Nora needed to regain her strength and confidence. Her hands, soft from years of indoor domesticity, gradually developed the calluses that came from handling tools and caring for animals. She learned to milk the cow, collect eggs without spooking the hens, and even helped Elias repair a section of fence that had been damaged in a recent storm. "You're a natural at this," he told her as she handed him nails with practiced efficiency. "Most people from town struggle with the physical demands of ranch work." "I like having something productive to do with my hands," she replied, steadying a fence post while he secured it. "In my marriage, I spent too much time sitting idle, waiting for something to happen. This feels useful." Working alongside him, Nora began to notice things about Elias that she hadn't seen during those first traumatic days. He moved with the quiet confidence of someone completely comfortable in his environment, but there was a gentleness in how he handled the animals that spoke to his fundamental character. He never raised his voice in anger, never struck out in frustration, and treated every living creature on his ranch with the kind of respect that came from understanding his role as caretaker rather than master. She also began to see the loneliness he carried, though he was careful not to burden either her or Lucy with his private griefs. Sometimes she'd catch him looking toward the hill where Sarah was buried, his expression distant and melancholy. Other times, she'd notice how he'd start to reach for a second cup when making coffee in the morning, then catch himself with a small shake of his head. The isolation that protected them from discovery also meant that Elias rarely had adult conversation beyond their evening talks. She realized that she was filling a void in his life, just as he was filling one in hers, though neither of them spoke of it directly. As autumn deepened into the promise of winter, their daily routines became more intertwined. Nora took over, much of the cooking, freeing Elias to focus on the heavier outdoor work. She mended clothes with skill that impressed him, patched holes in the roof with steady hands, and even helped him move the cattle to winter pasture with a competence that suggested hidden reserves of capability. "Where did you learn to handle livestock?" he asked, after watching her calmly separate a stubborn bull from the herd. "My father raised cattle before he lost the ranch," she replied, coiling the rope she'd used with practiced ease. "I spent most of my childhood helping him, at least until my mother decided I was old enough to need proper ladies' training. And you missed it. The outdoor work? More than I realized." She looked around at the vast expanse of prairie stretching toward the mountains, her eyes bright with something that might have been contentment. "There's something honest about this kind of life. The work is hard, but it's real. You can see what you've accomplished at the end of each day." Their partnership extended beyond practical matters into the realm of caring for Lucy, and here Nora truly shined. The little girl, hungry for feminine guidance and maternal attention, bloomed under her care. Nora braided her hair into intricate patterns, taught her songs her own mother had sung, and listened with genuine interest to the endless stream of observations and questions that flowed from an 8-year-old mind. "Nora, why do the leaves change colors?" Lucy asked one afternoon as they gathered the last vegetables from the garden. "Well, the trees are getting ready for winter sleep," Nora explained, pulling carrots from the hard ground. "They pull all their energy back into their roots to keep warm, and when they stop feeding the leaves, the green fades away and lets us see the other colors that were hiding underneath all along." "So, the pretty colors were always there?" "Always. Sometimes the most beautiful things are hidden until just the right time for them to show themselves." Elias, overhearing from where he was splitting wood nearby, felt his chest tighten with emotion. There was something profound in that simple explanation, something that seemed to apply to more than just autumn leaves. Nora herself had been hidden, buried beneath the surface of her circumstances, until the right moment had allowed her true nature to emerge. The evenings had become the time they all treasured most. After supper, they'd gather around the fire, Lucy working on her needlepoint while Nora read aloud from one of the books Elias had inherited from his father. Her voice was warm and expressive, bringing characters to life in ways that held both. Her listeners spellbound. "More, please," Lucy would beg when Nora reached the end of a chapter. "Tomorrow," Nora would promise, closing the book with a smile. "Good stories are meant to be savored, not rushed through." On one such evening, as November wind rattled the windows and the fire crackled cheerfully in the grate, Lucy fell asleep in her chair, the wooden doll clutched in her arms. Elias moved to carry her to bed, and Nora followed to help tuck her in. "She's a wonderful child," Nora whispered as they stood in the doorway watching Lucy sleep. "You've done an extraordinary job raising her alone." "I've done my best," Elias replied quietly, "but I've always worried that I couldn't give her everything she needed. She needs love, security, and the knowledge that she matters. You've given her all of that and more." They stood there for a moment longer, both thinking about the strange turns life could take, the unexpected ways that families could form and hearts could heal. When they finally returned to the main room, the fire had burned low, casting dancing shadows on the walls. "Elias," Nora said, as they moved to bank the coals for the night, "I want you to know how grateful I am, not just for saving my life, but for giving me a place where I can be useful, where I can matter to someone again." He turned to look at her, seeing in the firelight the woman she'd become over these weeks. Stronger, more confident, with a glow of health and purpose that transformed her entirely from the broken creature he'd pulled from the grave. "You do matter," he said simply, "to both of us, more than you know." The words carried weight beyond their simple meaning, acknowledging something that had been growing between them, something neither was quite ready to name, but both recognized as precious and fragile and worth protecting. Outside, the wind continued its lonely song across the prairie, but inside, three people who had found each other against all odds settled into the warm certainty that they were no longer alone. Winter arrived early that year, sweeping down from the mountains with a ferocity that caught even the most experienced settlers off guard. By mid-November, snow lay 3 feet deep across the prairie, and the wind carried a bite that could freeze exposed skin in minutes. For Nora, the harsh weather represented both blessing and curse. While it made discovery nearly impossible, it also trapped them in close quarters that tested the boundaries of their carefully maintained relationships. The ranch became a small world unto itself, cut off from the outside by walls of snow and sheets of ice. Elias had prepared well for winter, but feeding 3 people instead of 2 strained their supplies in ways that required careful planning and creative solutions. More concerning was the way the isolation pressed against them, making every interaction charged with unspoken tensions and growing awareness of each other. It was during these long winter evenings that Nora began experiencing the nightmares. They came without warning, usually in the darkest hours before dawn, pulling her from sleep, with gasping screams that echoed through the small house. She would find herself clawing at blankets, fighting against imaginary dirt, reliving those terrible hours when she'd been buried alive with only the sound of her own breathing and the weight of earth above her. The first time it happened, Elias burst into the main room where she slept on a makeshift bed near the fireplace, thinking someone had broken in. Instead, he found her sitting up, trembling and disoriented, her eyes wide with terror that had nothing to do with the present moment. "I'm sorry," she whispered, pulling her shawl tighter around her shoulders. "I didn't mean to wake you." "Don't apologize," He moved to stoke the fire, giving her time to compose herself while bathing the room in warm light. "Do you want to talk about it?" She shook her head, but as the nights continued and the dreams persisted, she found herself sharing fragments of the horror with him, the feeling of suffocation, the panic of being trapped, the absolute certainty that she would die alone and forgotten in that terrible darkness. "I keep thinking about how easily they did it," she told him one night after a particularly violent nightmare had left her shaking and pale. "How they just erased me, made everyone believe I was gone. It would have worked if you hadn't found me." Elias sat in the chair across from her, fully dressed despite the late hour. He'd taken to sleeping lightly, listening for the signs that another nightmare was building. The iron poker from the fireplace lay within easy reach, not because he expected physical danger, but because the weight and coldness of it seemed to comfort Nora, reminding her that she had means to defend herself now. "But I did find you," he said gently, "and you're here, alive and safe." They failed, this time. But what happens when spring comes, when the snow melts and people start traveling again? "Thomas will want to check on my grave, make sure no one's disturbed it." The practical concerns mixed with the psychological trauma, creating a burden that seemed to weigh heavier as the winter deepened. During the day, Nora could lose herself in the routines of ranch life, but at night, alone with her thoughts, the magnitude of her situation pressed down like the earth that had once covered her. It was Lucy who provided the solution, with the uncomplicated wisdom that children sometimes possessed. "Why don't you sleep in my room?" she asked, after finding Nora and her father having another hushed conversation by the dying fire. "I have bad dreams sometimes too, and it helps when Papa sits with me." The suggestion was so simple, so innocent, that both adults felt foolish for not thinking of it sooner. Lucy's room was small but warm, with space for a second bed, and the child's presence seemed to chase away the worst of Nora's terrors. More importantly, it solved the growing problem of propriety that neither Elias nor Nora had wanted to address directly. As the weeks passed and they grew more comfortable in their shared isolation, the careful boundaries they'd maintained began to blur in subtle ways. Nora would place her hand on Elias's shoulder when leaning over to serve dinner. He would steady her with a touch to her waist when she reached for something on a high shelf. Their conversations grew longer and more intimate, extending deep into the night as they discovered how much they had in common. Sarah wanted to travel, Elias told her one evening, as they worked together to prepare wool for spinning. She'd read about places like San Francisco and New York, and she'd get this look in her eyes, like she could see herself walking down those distant streets. "Did you want to go with her?" "I thought I did. But looking back, I think I was more in love with her excitement than with the idea of leaving. This place, this land, it's become part of me in ways I didn't expect." Nora nodded, understanding the deep connection between a person and the land they'd worked to make their own. "Henry used to talk about moving to California, starting fresh, where no one knew us. After a few years of marriage, I think he meant where no one knew I was barren." "You're not barren," Elias said with unexpected intensity. "You're just waiting for the right circumstances." The words hung between them, loaded with implications neither was quite ready to explore. But they were both aware of the growing attraction, the way their eyes lingered on each other when they thought the other wasn't looking, the careful dance they performed to avoid accidental touches that might reveal too much. The crisis came in early December, when Lucy developed a fever that spiked dangerously high and left her delirious and struggling to breathe. For 3 days and nights, Nora and Elias took turns sitting by her bedside, cooling her with damp cloths and forcing small sips of water past her cracked lips. "We need to get her to Dr. Whitman," Elias said on the third night, his voice rough with exhaustion and fear. "In this weather? Through snow that deep?" Nora looked toward the window where wind-driven snow obscured everything beyond a few yards. "You'd never make it to town, and even if you did, you couldn't get back." "Then what do we do?" The helplessness in his voice broke her heart. Here was a man who could handle any crisis the ranch could throw at him, reduced to powerlessness by his daughter's illness. "We fight," Nora said simply. "We keep her cool, keep her hydrated, and we don't give up." They worked through the night as a team, sharing the vigil that required constant attention. When Lucy's fever broke just before dawn, both adults collapsed into chairs beside her bed, emotionally drained but overwhelmed with relief. "Thank you," Elias whispered, reaching across the small space to take Nora's hand. "I couldn't have done this alone." "You wouldn't have had to," she replied, her fingers intertwining with his. "That's what families do. They take care of each other." The word hung in the air between them. Family. It was the first time either had used it to describe their arrangement, but it felt right in a way that formal terms like guest or helper never had. As Lucy slept peacefully for the first time in days, Elias and Nora found themselves alone in the kitchen, sharing a quiet breakfast as dawn broke over the snow-covered landscape. The crisis had stripped away pretense, leaving them raw and honest in ways that daylight and routine usually prevented. "Nora," Elias began, then stopped, seeming to gather courage for what he wanted to say. "Yes, when spring comes, when this isolation ends, and we have to face whatever comes next, I want you to know that you'll always have a place here. Not as a temporary guest or someone we're helping out of charity, but as part of this family." She looked at him across the table, seeing the sincerity in his tired eyes, the way his hair stuck up from running his hands through it during the long night, the strength in his weathered hands that had been so gentle with his sick daughter. "Even if it puts you at risk, even if people talk, let them talk." His voice carried a conviction she hadn't heard before. "I've spent too much of my life worrying about what other people think is proper or right. What I know is right is that Lucy needs you, that this ranch runs better with you here, and that He paused, then took the leap. "That I can't imagine my life without you in it anymore." The declaration settled between them like a bridge finally built across a canyon they'd been carefully avoiding. Nora felt tears prick her eyes, not the bitter tears of grief or fear that had marked so much of her recent life, but the sweet tears of someone who had given up hope of being truly wanted and found it in the most unexpected place. "I feel the same way," she whispered, "about all of it, about Lucy, about this place, about—" She reached across the table to cover his hand with hers. "About you." When their lips met across the small table, it was with the desperate tenderness of two people who had found each other against impossible odds. The kiss tasted of coffee and exhaustion, and the profound relief of no longer having to pretend that what they felt was simple gratitude or convenient partnership. Outside, the wind continued its winter song, piling snow against the windows and sealing them away from a world that had tried to destroy them both. But inside, by the warmth of the fire and the deeper warmth of newfound love, three people who had become a family, prepared to face whatever challenges the spring might bring. Together, spring arrived with deceptive gentleness, melting the snow in slow stages that revealed the prairie like a photograph developing in solution. The harsh winter that had protected them with its isolation began to retreat, taking with it the cocoon of safety that had allowed their unconventional family to flourish. As the roads became passable again and neighbors began venturing out to check on each other, the reality of their situation pressed upon them with renewed urgency. Elias made his first trip to town in nearly 4 months on a bright March morning, taking the wagon to collect supplies that couldn't be delayed any longer. The list of needed items was longer than usual. Extra flour, more fabric, additional medical supplies, purchases that would raise questions from Mrs. Henderson at the general store if she noticed the pattern. "Be careful," Nora had whispered as she helped him load the wagon before dawn. "Remember, you're a widower with a young daughter, nothing more." "I know." He'd kissed her forehead, a gesture that had become natural over the winter months. "Keep Lucy close to the house while I'm gone. If anyone comes by, we'll be ready." She touched the iron poker that now lived within easy reach of the kitchen door, its weight a comfort that had nothing to do with tending fires. The ride to Millfield took him through landscape transformed by the changing season. Streams ran high. With snowmelt, meadowlarks called from fence posts, and the air carried the sweet scent of new grass. It should have been a journey that lifted his spirits, but instead Elias felt the weight of returning to a world where he'd have to guard every word and watch every expression. Millfield had changed little during the winter months, but the people seemed different somehow, more watchful, more prone to gathering in small groups that dispersed when outsiders approached. The general store buzzed with conversation that died as soon as Elias entered, replaced by the kind of polite greetings that carried undertones of careful assessment. "Elias Boone!" Mrs. Henderson's voice held the forced cheer of someone determined to extract information. "We haven't seen you since before the big snows. How did you and little Lucy fare through the winter?" "Well enough," he replied, placing his order with careful attention to quantities. "Lucy stayed healthy, and we had adequate supplies." "That's wonderful to hear. Some folks weren't so fortunate." She leaned across the counter with the conspiratorial air of someone sharing important news. "Did you hear about the troubles at the Morrison place? Strange things happening out there. Livestock acting spooked, tools going missing, signs that someone's been prowling around their property." Elias kept his expression neutral while his pulse quickened. The Morrison ranch was only 6 miles from his own, close enough that any mysterious activity could eventually expand to include his property. What kind of signs? Footprints where they shouldn't be, disturbances around the house at night. Tom Morrison swears he's seen someone watching from the tree line, but whenever he goes to investigate, there's no one there. She lowered her voice dramatically. "Some folks are saying it might be connected to that business with poor Nora Wren." The name hit him like a physical blow, but he forced himself to respond with mild curiosity. "I'm not sure I follow." "Well, you know how these things go. When someone dies under unusual circumstances, sometimes the spirits don't rest easy, and with her buried so far from consecrated ground without proper ceremony." She shook her head with the satisfaction of someone who'd always known such arrangements would lead to trouble. "You think Mrs. Wren's ghost is troubling the Morrison place?" "I'm not saying that exactly, but there's been talk. Her brother-in-law, Thomas, has been asking questions around town, wondering if anyone's noticed anything strange. Says he wants to make sure she's resting peacefully." Mrs. Henderson's tone suggested she found Thomas Wren's sudden concern for his dead sister-in-law touching rather than suspicious. Elias completed his purchases with growing unease, each item carefully wrapped and loaded while his mind raced through the implications of what he'd heard. Thomas Wren was actively investigating, looking for signs that his crime hadn't been as successful as he'd believed. The mysterious activity at the Morrison place could be unrelated, or it could be evidence that someone was searching, probing, testing the edges of the community for signs of the woman he'd tried to bury. As he prepared to leave town, Pastor Garrett approached the wagon with the measured pace of someone carrying weighty news. "Elias, I'm glad I caught you. There's something I need to discuss with you, a delicate matter that requires discretion." "Of course, Pastor. What can I help you with?" "There's been talk lately about irregularities in the community, people reporting strange occurrences, unexplained disturbances. Some of the more superstitious members of the congregation are beginning to whisper about curses and unquiet spirits." Elias felt sweat gather at the base of his neck, despite the cool spring air. "That sounds like frontier nerves more than anything supernatural." "I agree, but perception has a way of becoming reality in small communities. What concerns me is that Thomas Wren has been fanning these fears, suggesting that his sister-in-law's death may have left some kind of spiritual residue that's affecting the area." "That seems unlikely." "Indeed, but Thomas has influence with certain families, and he's been very persuasive about the need to investigate these disturbances thoroughly. He's even suggested that someone might have interfered with Nora's burial site, that grave robbers or other parties might have disturbed her rest. The words chilled Elias more than any winter storm. Thomas wasn't just investigating randomly. He suspected that someone had found Nora's grave, and he was using superstition and fear to justify a systematic search of the area. I wanted to warn you because your ranch is somewhat isolated, and isolated places often become targets for this kind of speculation. If anyone approaches you, asking questions about unusual activities or requesting to search your property, I hope you'll come to me before agreeing to anything. Thank you for the warning, Pastor. I'll certainly keep that in mind. As Elias drove home through the lengthening afternoon, he carried with him more than supplies. He brought news that changed everything they thought they knew about their safety. The town newspaper, folded among his purchases, contained an article that made his blood run cold when he read it later that evening. Local ranchers report mysterious disturbances, the headline read, followed by a detailed account of the supposedly supernatural events plaguing the community. But buried in the middle of the article was a paragraph that revealed the true purpose behind the investigation. Thomas Wren, brother-in-law to the late Nora Wren, has offered a substantial reward for information leading to the resolution of these disturbances. Mr. Wren believes that proper burial rites may not have been observed during his sister-in-law's interment, and he wishes to ensure that all spiritual matters are appropriately addressed. Anyone with knowledge of unusual activities near burial sites or remote areas is encouraged to come forward. Nora read the article with growing horror, her hands trembling as she grasped the full extent of the trap being laid around them. "He knows," she whispered. "He may not be certain, but he suspects that something went wrong. The reward money will bring every treasure hunter and gossip in 3 counties looking for signs of disturbance. We need to plan for the possibility that someone will come here," Elias said grimly. "If Thomas is actively searching, if he's offering money for information, it's only a matter of time before someone decides to investigate every ranch in the area." Lucy looked up from where she'd been playing with her wooden doll, sensing the tension in the adults' voices without understanding its source. "Are we in trouble, Papa?" "Not trouble exactly," Elias replied carefully. "But we need to be extra careful for a while. Some people in town are confused about some things, and we don't want to add to their confusion." Over the following weeks, they began to notice signs that their sanctuary was no longer as secure as they'd believed. Riders passed along the road more frequently than usual, sometimes slowing to peer toward the house with obvious curiosity. Neighbors who hadn't visited in months suddenly found reasons to stop by, their conversations carrying an undercurrent of probing questions about how Elias had managed so well through the difficult winter. "You're looking well fed for someone who spent the cold months alone with a child," Henrik from the general store observed during one such visit. "Good planning on your part, I suppose." "Sarah taught me to be prepared," Elias replied evenly, "and Lucy's grown old enough to be real help around the place. But the scrutiny was taking its toll on all of them. Nora rarely ventured outside, during daylight hours, and even then only to areas that couldn't be seen from the road. Lucy, sensing the adults' anxiety, became quieter and more watchful, her innocent chatter replaced by careful observation of every visitor and unusual sound. The breaking point came when Thomas Wren himself appeared at their gate one afternoon, accompanied by 2 men Elias didn't recognize. They rode with the purposeful air of people conducting official business, and their presence sent ice through his veins. "Mr. Boone," Thomas called out as Elias emerged from the barn. "I hope you don't mind the intrusion. I'm conducting some inquiries related to the recent disturbances in the area. Of course. What can I help you with?" Thomas Wren was a man in his 40s, with the soft build of someone who managed property rather than working it directly. His eyes held a calculating intelligence that made Elias understand how he'd managed to convince an entire community that murder was an act of family responsibility. "I'm looking into reports of unusual activities," signs that someone may have been interfering with burial sites or disturbing areas that should be left in peace. Have you noticed anything strange on your property or the surrounding area? Nothing. Unusual, Elias replied, forcing his voice to remain steady. Though I spend most of my time focused on ranch work rather than watching for disturbances. Of course. Still, I wonder if I might have a look around. Just to put minds at ease, you understand. There's been so much speculation lately. And I find that a thorough investigation often settles fears better than assumptions. The request hung in the air like a challenge. To refuse would seem suspicious, but to allow Thomas onto his property would put Nora at terrible risk. Inside the house, she was listening to every word, probably gripping that iron poker and preparing for the confrontation that had haunted her nightmares. I appreciate your thoroughness, Mr. Wren, but I'm not comfortable with strangers roaming around my property, especially with my young daughter to consider. I'm sure you understand a father's concerns. Thomas's smile didn't reach his eyes. Naturally, though I should mention that these aren't exactly social calls. The disturbances have become serious enough that Sheriff Williams has asked me to assist with the investigation. I'd hate for anyone to be seen as uncooperative with a matter of community safety. The threat was subtle but clear. Comply, or face the consequences of being labeled as someone with something to hide. Elias felt the weight of the moment, understanding that whatever choice he made would determine the course of their lives from this point forward. Inside the house, Nora pressed herself against the wall beside the window, the iron poker solid and reassuring in her hands. Through the gap in the curtains, she could see the man who had tried to bury her alive, who had convinced himself and others that her death was justified and necessary. The sight of him filled her with a fury that burned away fear and replaced it with something harder and more dangerous. For the first time since clawing her way out of that grave, Nora Wren felt ready to fight. The tension stretched taut as a wire between the two men, each measuring the other's resolve, while the weight of unspoken accusations hung in the air. Elias was preparing to make his final refusal when an unexpected voice cut through the standoff. "Papa, who are these men?" Lucy had emerged from the house, her wooden doll clutched in one arm, and her expression holding that peculiar blend of curiosity and caution that children develop when they sense adult tensions they don't understand. Her appearance shifted the dynamics entirely, reminding everyone present that this was a home with a child, not just a property to be searched. "These gentlemen are from town, sweetheart," Elias replied, moving protectively closer to his daughter. They were just leaving, but Thomas Wren's attention had focused on something else entirely. His gaze moved past Lucy to the house behind her, and his expression shifted from calculating patience to sharp alertness. Following his line of sight, Elias felt his heart stop. Smoke was rising from the chimney in a pattern that suggested someone had just stoked the fire. Laundry hung on the line that hadn't been there that morning, women's clothing that clearly didn't belong to an 8-year-old girl. Most damning of all, through the open door behind Lucy, the faint sound of someone moving around inside could be heard by anyone paying attention. "Mr. Boone," Thomas said slowly, his voice taking on a dangerous edge, "it seems you've been less than truthful about your household circumstances." "I don't know what you mean, don't you?" Thomas dismounted from his horse, his companions following, suit with movements that suggested they'd prepared for exactly this possibility. The signs of a woman's presence are quite obvious to anyone who knows what to look for. The question is, who is she, and why are you hiding her? Elias felt the moment balanced on a knife's edge. Every instinct told him to continue denying, to send these men away and hope their suspicions wouldn't crystallize into action. But before he could speak, the decision was taken out of his hands. Nora appeared in the doorway behind Lucy, her chin raised defiantly and the iron poker held openly in her right hand. She'd made the choice to stop hiding, to face her would-be murderer directly rather than cower in the shadows while others fought her battles. The effect on Thomas Wren was immediate and dramatic. The color drained from his face as if he'd seen an actual ghost, and he stumbled backward with a strangled sound that was part gasp, part curse. "Hello, Thomas," Nora said with deadly calm. "Surprised to see me?" For a moment, the tableau held. Thomas staring in shock, his companions confused by his reaction, Elias poised to act, and Lucy looking between the adults with growing alarm. Then Thomas found his voice, though it came out as a croak. "You're dead. You're supposed to be dead. Yes, I know, you made quite sure of that, didn't you? Or thought you did." Nora stepped fully into view, and Elias could see the transformation that had taken place in her over the winter months. This wasn't the broken, desperate woman he'd pulled from the grave. This was someone who had found her strength and was prepared to use it. "This is impossible," Thomas whispered, then louder. "This is impossible. I buried you myself. I saw you stop breathing. I covered you with earth. I marked the grave. You marked a grave, certainly, but you made one crucial mistake, Thomas. You assumed that wanting someone dead was the same as actually killing them." The confession hung in the air like smoke, witnessed by Thomas's own companions, who were beginning to understand that they'd stumbled into something far more serious than investigating supernatural disturbances. One of them, a younger man with the look of a ranch hand, actually stepped back from Thomas, as if proximity might make him complicit in whatever had been revealed. "You're a liar," Thomas snarled, but his voice lacked conviction. "You're some kind of imposter, trying to claim what exactly?" Nora interrupted. "What could I possibly want to claim, Thomas, that would make you so desperate to see me dead?" It was then that Elias realized they were witnessing something more complex than simple family malice. The pure panic in Thomas's eyes suggested stakes higher than just removing an unwanted burden from the family. There was something else at play, something that made Nora's continued existence a genuine threat to Thomas's interests. "Mr. Wren," one of his companions said uncertainly. "Perhaps we should—" "Shut up," Thomas snapped, his composure cracking entirely. "You don't understand what this means. She can't be alive. She has to be dead, or everything—" He stopped himself, but the damage was done. "Or everything." "What, Thomas?" Nora pressed. "What exactly happens if I'm alive that frightens you so?" "Much?" The answer came from an unexpected source. Lucy, who had been listening with the intense focus children brought to adult conversations they sensed were important, suddenly spoke up. "Are you talking about the papers, Papa? The ones that came in the mail last month?" Elias looked down at his daughter in confusion, then felt a chill as he remembered the official-looking envelope that had arrived addressed to the estate of Henry Wren, or his lawful heirs. He'd assumed it was some kind of legal formality related to settling Henry's affairs and had set it aside, meaning to deal with it when he next went to town. "What papers?" Nora asked, her attention shifting between Elias and Lucy. "They're in Papa's desk," Lucy said helpfully. "Big brown envelope with fancy writing. Papa said it was probably just business stuff. But the man who brought it said it was important." Thomas Wren had gone very still, his face now pale with something beyond shock. "You received correspondence addressed to Henry's estate several months ago," Elias confirmed, understanding beginning to dawn. "I haven't opened it yet, but—" "Get it," Nora said quietly, her eyes never leaving Thomas's face. "I think we're about to discover why my death was so necessary." Elias hesitated, reluctant to leave Nora alone with Thomas, even for the few minutes it would take to retrieve the envelope. But she gave him a slight nod, her grip firm on the poker, and he realized she was ready for whatever confrontation might come. The envelope, when he returned with it, proved to contain documents that recontextualized everything they thought they knew about the situation. The papers were from a law firm in Denver, and they concerned a substantial inheritance that had been discovered in the complex web of Henry Wren's family connections. "Henry's great-uncle in California died without direct heirs," Nora read aloud, her voice growing stronger with each revelation. His estate, including mining claims worth an estimated $50,000, is to be distributed among his surviving relatives. Primary beneficiary, Henry Wren, deceased. Secondary beneficiary, Henry's lawful widow, Nora Wren. The silence that followed was profound. $50,000 was a fortune that could transform lives, establish dynasties, and apparently motivate. Murder. Thomas's desperate gamble to eliminate Nora before this inheritance was discovered made terrible sense now. With her dead and no official record of the bequest, he could have claimed the money as Henry's closest male relative. "You tried to kill me for money," Nora said, and there was wonder in her voice at the banality of it. "Not because I was barren, not because I was cursed or unwanted. You buried me alive for $50,000. "You don't understand," Thomas said desperately. "My family has debts, obligations. That money could have saved dozens of people, helped the whole community. One barren woman's life against the welfare of—" "Stop!" The word cracked like a whip, and everyone present understood that Nora had reached the limit of what she would tolerate. "Don't you dare try to justify attempted murder as community service. You wanted the money for yourself, and you convinced yourself that killing me was acceptable because I was convenient to dispose of." Thomas's companions were backing away now, clearly wanting no part of what they'd stumbled into. The younger man actually mounted his horse, his eyes wide with the understanding that he'd nearly become accessory to questioning a murder victim. "Mr. Wren," he called out, "I think we should head back to town. This isn't what you told us we'd be doing." But Thomas seemed incapable of retreat. Perhaps it was the shock of seeing his carefully constructed crime unraveling, or perhaps it was the desperate calculation that silence was his only remaining option. Whatever the reason, he suddenly lunged toward Nora with a movement that suggested he intended to finish what he'd started months ago. He never reached her. Elias intercepted him with a tackle that sent both men crashing to the ground, while Nora stepped protectively in front of Lucy, the poker raised and ready. The struggle was brief but violent, ending when Elias's superior strength and Thomas's poor physical condition made the outcome inevitable. "Stay down," Elias panted, pinning Thomas to the ground while the man gasped and wheezed beneath him. "You've done enough damage for one lifetime." As the dust settled and Thomas's remaining companion rode hard toward town, presumably to fetch the sheriff, Nora found herself looking down at the man who had tried to erase her from existence. He seemed smaller now, diminished by the exposure of his greed and the failure of his schemes. "You know what the worst part is, Thomas," she said quietly. "If you'd simply told me about the inheritance, I probably would have shared it with Henry's family. I never wanted to be wealthy. I just wanted to belong somewhere, to matter to someone. You could have had everything you wanted without committing a single crime." The tragic irony of it settled over them all. Thomas Wren had destroyed lives and risked everything for money he could have obtained through simple honesty, revealing a poverty of character that went far deeper than any financial need. As they waited for the sheriff to arrive, Nora sat on the porch steps with Lucy beside her, the legal documents still clutched in her hands. The inheritance that had motivated such evil would now provide the security and independence she'd never dreamed possible. But more importantly, the truth was finally in the open, and the long months of hiding and fear were coming to an end. "What happens now?" Lucy asked, leaning against Nora's side with the trust that had never wavered despite all the adult complications swirling around her. "Now we tell the truth," Nora replied, wrapping an arm around the child who had become her daughter in every way that mattered. "And we find out what it means to live without secrets." In the distance, a cloud of dust announced the approach of riders from town. Soon there would be questions, investigations, and the complex process of untangling months of deception and years of greed. But for the first time since clawing her way out of that lonely grave, Nora felt truly free, not just from the earth that had covered her, but from the fear and uncertainty that had buried her spirit just as surely as Thomas had tried to bury. Her body. Sheriff Williams arrived within the hour, accompanied by Pastor Garrett and a small group of townspeople who had heard fragments of the story from Thomas's fleeing companion. The sight of Nora alive and well sent shockwaves through the assembled crowd, some crossing themselves as if witnessing a resurrection, others whispering among themselves about the implications of what they were seeing. "Mrs. Wren," Sheriff Williams said slowly, removing his hat as he approached the porch where she sat. "Ma'am, I have to say, this is about the most unusual situation I've encountered in 20 years of law enforcement." "I imagine it is, Sheriff," Nora replied with a composure that surprised everyone present, including herself, though I suspect it's about to become even more complicated. The sheriff was a weathered man in his 50s, known for his methodical approach to problems and his reluctance to jump to conclusions. He surveyed the scene, Thomas Wren bound and subdued, the legal documents scattered on the porch, and the obvious signs of a household that had been hiding secrets for months. "Mr. Wren here claims that you're an imposter, that the real Nora Wren died of fever up north and was buried according to proper Christian rites. He says you're some kind of confidence woman trying to claim a dead woman's inheritance." "And what do you think, Sheriff?" Nora asked. "Well, ma'am, I knew you by sight from church services, and you certainly look like Nora Wren to me. But then again, I also heard Pastor Garrett here conduct a memorial service for you back in October, and I've seen stranger things happen on the frontier than people pretending to be dead relatives for money." Pastor Garrett stepped forward, his face troubled but determined. "Sheriff, I've been praying about this situation ever since word reached town, and I believe we need to hear the whole truth before making any judgments. There were aspects of Mrs. Wren's supposed death that troubled me at the time, such as the story never quite made sense. Thomas claimed she'd taken ill while visiting relatives, but no one could name these relatives or provide details about where exactly she died. When I offered to write letters of condolence or arrange for the body to be returned for proper burial, I was told it had already been taken care of, that asking questions would only cause more grief for the family." Thomas, still pinned beneath Elias's firm grip, struggled to speak. "She's a fraud, I tell you. The real Nora Wren is dead and buried, and this woman is taking advantage of—" "Thomas," Nora interrupted quietly, "would you like me to tell them about the rope burns around my ankles? About the specific way you tied my hands before you buried me? About the words you spoke over my grave before you rode away? The detailed knowledge silenced him more effectively than any shout could have done." Sheriff Williams knelt beside the bound man, studying his face with the sharp attention of someone trained to read guilt and innocence in human expressions. "Mr. Wren, I'm going to ask you some direct questions, and I'd advise you to think carefully before answering. Did you, or did you not, take Mrs. Nora Wren into the desert last October under false pretenses?" Thomas's voice failed him, his eyes darting desperately around the circle of faces as if looking for support that wasn't coming. "Did you, or did you not, attempt to bury her alive in an unmarked grave?" "You don't understand the situation," Thomas said desperately. "She was barren, cursed. The whole community was suffering because of her presence. I was trying to save—" "So you admit to attempted murder," Sheriff Williams said flatly. The words hung in the air like a judge's sentence, making the reality of the situation unavoidable for everyone present. This wasn't a case of mistaken identity or family dispute. It was a criminal matter of the most serious kind, and Thomas Wren had just confessed to it in front of a dozen witnesses. But even as the legal machinery began to turn, Nora sensed that their troubles were far from over. The crowd that had gathered was showing signs of agitation that went beyond simple shock at the revelation. She could see fear in their faces, confusion about what Thomas's crimes meant for the community's reputation, and most troubling of all, anger that seemed to be seeking a target. "How do we know she's telling the truth?" a voice called from the back of the crowd. "Maybe she did die, and this is something else entirely. Maybe Thomas was right about the curse." "Don't be ridiculous," Pastor Garrett said firmly. "This is a woman who has suffered a terrible crime, not some supernatural—" "Then why didn't she come forward sooner?" another voice demanded. "Why hide out here for months instead of going to the authorities?" Nora felt the mood of the crowd shifting, the initial sympathy for her ordeal being replaced by suspicion and superstition. She recognized the phenomenon from her marriage. People preferred simple explanations to complex truths, and they often blamed victims for the inconvenience of disrupting comfortable assumptions. "I hid because I was afraid," she said, standing to face the crowd directly, "because Thomas had convinced everyone I was dead, and I knew that if he discovered I had survived, he would try again, because I had nowhere else to go and no one else to trust." "Except him," someone said, pointing at Elias with an accusatory tone. "Convenient that the widower with the isolated ranch just happened to find you. Mighty convenient that he's been keeping you hidden all winter." The implication in the speaker's voice was clear, and Nora felt anger flare in her chest. They were suggesting that her rescue had been something shameful, that Elias's kindness was evidence of impropriety rather than Christian charity. "Mr. Boone saved my life," she said with quiet intensity. "He found me clawing my way out of my own grave, and he took me in when any other man might have ridden away rather than get involved. If that troubles your sense of propriety, perhaps you should examine your own hearts rather than judging his actions." Elias stepped up beside her, his presence solid and reassuring. "I'd do the same thing again," he said simply, "and I'll stand by Mrs. Wren against anyone who suggests she's done anything wrong." The declaration sent a ripple through the crowd, some nodding in approval, while others exchanged glances that suggested they found such loyalty suspicious. Sheriff Williams, recognizing the volatile nature of the situation, moved to take control before emotions could escalate further. "Right now, we have a confessed attempted murderer to deal with," he said firmly. "Whatever other questions need. Answering can wait until we've sorted out the legal matters. Mr. Wren, you're under arrest for attempted murder and fraud. Pastor, I'll need you to help organize witness statements. Everyone else, I suggest you head home and let the law handle this situation." But even as the immediate crisis was being managed, Nora could see that their problems were far from resolved. The crowd was dispersing reluctantly, many casting backward glances that suggested they weren't satisfied with the explanations they'd received. Worse, she could see Thomas smirking despite his restraints, as if he knew something about the community's reaction that others had missed. As the sheriff prepared to transport his prisoner to town, Thomas managed one final attempt to poison the well of public opinion. "You think this is over?" he called out loud enough for everyone to hear. "You think you can just pick up where you left off, living in sin on that isolated ranch? The decent people of this community won't stand for it. They'll find ways to make their displeasure known." Sheriff Williams roughly silenced him, but the damage was done. The seed of scandal had been planted, and Nora could see in the faces around her that it was already beginning to sprout. Her survival had exposed Thomas's crimes, but it had also created a new set of problems that might prove just as dangerous. In their own way, that evening, as the last of the visitors departed and quiet settled over the ranch, the three of them gathered in the kitchen to assess their situation. Lucy had been sent to her room early, ostensibly for her normal bedtime, but actually to allow the adults to speak freely about the challenges ahead. "They're not going to let this rest," Nora said, staring into the fire that had become such a source of comfort over the long winter months. "Thomas might be in jail, but the questions he raised about our living arrangements, about what happened between us during the winter, those aren't going away." Elias reached across the table to take her hand, his calloused fingers warm and steady against hers. "Then we need to decide what we want to do about it. We can let their gossip drive us apart, or we can face it together. What are you saying?" "I'm saying that I love you, and Lucy loves you, and this ranch is your home now, whether the neighbors approve or not. I'm saying that we've been living as a family for months, and maybe it's time to make that official." The proposal hung between them, simple and honest and fraught with implications. Marriage would legitimize their relationship in the eyes of the community, but it would also bind them together at a time when either of them might reasonably want the freedom to start over somewhere else. The inheritance money, Nora said slowly. $50,000 would be enough to go anywhere, start fresh where no one knows our history. It would be, Elias agreed. Is that what you want? She looked around the kitchen that had become her sanctuary, thought about the bedroom where she'd learned to sleep without nightmares, remembered the countless evening conversations that had taught her what it meant to be truly known and accepted by another person. No, she said firmly, I don't want to run anymore. I want to stay here with you and Lucy and build the life we've already started building. Let them gossip, let them disapprove. This is where I belong. From his position by the window, where he'd been checking the locks and securing the house for the night, Elias retrieved his father's old shotgun from its place above the door. The weapon was well maintained despite its age, a reliable tool that had protected the Boone family for 2 generations. Then we'd better be prepared for whatever comes next, he said, checking the gun's action with practiced efficiency. Because something tells me Thomas wasn't wrong about one thing. This community isn't done with us yet. Outside, the prairie. Wind carried the scent of spring rain and new grass, promising growth and renewal after the long winter. But it also carried something else. The faint sound of riders moving in the distance, too far away to identify, but close enough to suggest that their troubles were far from over. As they prepared for bed, each of them understood that the next few days would test everything they'd built together. The truth was out now, the secret revealed, but truth had a way of creating its own complications. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new enemies, and new tests of their resolve to stand together against a world that seemed determined to tear them apart. But tonight, they were together under their own roof, with the fire burning warm and the future spread before them like an unwritten page. Whatever came next, they would face it as a family, the family they had chosen to become, despite every obstacle placed in their path. The attack came 2 nights later, announced by the hellish glow of lanterns moving across the prairie like fallen stars. Elias spotted them first from his bedroom window, a ragged line of lights approaching from the direction of town, too many and too purposeful to be anything but trouble. He counted at least 12 riders, maybe more, their lanterns swaying, with the rhythm of horses pushed harder than was safe in the darkness. Nora, he whispered urgently, shaking her awake where she slept in the chair beside Lucy's bed. Since the confrontation with Thomas, she'd insisted on keeping watch through the nights, unable to shake the feeling that danger was still approaching. They're coming! She was instantly alert, months of sleeping lightly having trained her to wake completely at the first sign of threat. Through the window, she could see what had alarmed him, a mob advancing with the deliberate menace of people who had worked themselves into righteous fury. How many? She asked, already moving to check on Lucy, who mercifully remained asleep. Despite the tension crackling through the house, too many, Elias replied grimly, reaching for the shotgun that had remained within arm's reach since their decision to stand and fight. But not so many that we can't make them think twice about whatever they're planning. The lanterns moved closer, revealing more details that chilled them both. These weren't the curious neighbors who had gathered during the sheriff's investigation. This was a different group entirely. Men whose faces were hidden by pulled-up bandanas and whose posture spoke of violence barely held in check. As they approached the house, their leader raised his lantern high, casting grotesque shadows that danced across the yard like demons. Elias Boone! The voice that called out was harsh and unfamiliar, distorted by anger and possibly alcohol. We know you're in there, and we know you're harboring that cursed woman. Time to set things right. Elias positioned himself at the front window, the shotgun ready, but not yet visible to the men outside. This is my property, he called back, his voice carrying the authority of a man defending his home. You have no business here. Move on before someone gets hurt." Mocking laughter rippled through the group, a sound that made Nora's skin crawl, with memories of other times when men had gathered to pass judgment on her worthiness to exist. She moved to the kitchen window, trying to get a better count of their attackers and assess possible escape routes. "We've got plenty of business here," the leader shouted back. "You've been living in sin with a woman who should be dead and buried, defying God's will and corrupting this community with your unnatural arrangements. Time to answer for it." "And what exactly do you propose to do about it?" Elias asked, though he suspected he already knew the answer. The lanterns, the covered faces, the late-night approach, all of it pointed toward vigilante justice of the most brutal kind. "We're here to finish what Thomas Wren started," came the chilling reply. "That woman is a curse on this land, and curses need to be burned out before they spread." The word "burned" sent ice through both Elias and Nora. They could see now that some of the riders carried more than lanterns. Torches that cast longer, hungrier flames into the night air. This wasn't just an intimidation visit or an attempt to force them to leave. This was meant to be an execution. "There's a child in this house," Nora called out, her voice carrying across the yard with surprising strength. "Whatever grievances you think you have with me, Lucy Boone has done nothing to deserve your anger. The child will be better off without the influence of a woman who consorts with darkness," the leader replied, with the pitiless certainty of someone who had convinced himself that cruelty was righteousness. "We'll see that she's placed with a proper Christian family, one that understands the natural order." That final threat crystallized everything for both Elias and Nora. This wasn't just about them anymore. These men intended to destroy their family entirely, to scatter them to the winds based on superstition and moral judgment that had nothing to do with actual wrongdoing. "Lucy," Nora whispered urgently, gently shaking the child awake. "Sweetheart, I need you to get dressed quickly and quietly. We're going to play a game where you hide in the root cellar until Papa and I come to get you." Lucy, still groggy, but sensing the urgency in Nora's voice, began pulling on her clothes without question. The root cellar was accessible through a trap door in the kitchen floor, hidden beneath a heavy rug, and sturdy enough to withstand most disasters. If things went badly, she would at least be safe there until help could arrive. Outside, the mob was growing impatient. The horses snorted and stamped, their riders shifting restlessly as they worked up the courage for whatever they intended to do. The lantern light revealed more details now, familiar faces from town, men who had seemed respectable enough during daylight hours, but had transformed into something uglier under the cover of darkness. "We're giving you one chance, Boone," the leader called out. "Send that woman out, and we'll let you and the child walk away. Try to protect her, and you'll burn alongside her." "Not a chance in hell," Elias replied, and Nora felt her heart swell with fierce love for this man who would risk everything rather than abandon her to mob justice. The response triggered a wave of angry shouts from the attackers, their restraint finally breaking as they spurred their horses forward. The first torch flew through the air, trailing sparks as it arced toward the house. Elias was ready for it, shooting the glass out of the front window and firing a warning blast over the heads of the advancing riders. The shotgun's roar split the night air, causing several horses to rear and their riders to curse as they fought for control. But it also announced that the residents of the house were armed and prepared to fight, escalating the confrontation to a level where bloodshed was inevitable. "That was your warning," Elias shouted, already reloading with practiced efficiency. "The next shot won't be over your heads." More torches flew toward the house, and Nora grabbed blankets to smother the flames that caught on the wooden walls. The acrid smell of smoke began to fill the air, and she realized they had only minutes before the structure would be too damaged to defend. "The barn," she said urgently. "If we can get to the barn, we'll have better cover and more room to maneuver." Elias nodded, understanding her thinking. The barn was stone-built at the foundation, with thick wooden walls, more defensible than the house and with multiple exits if retreat became necessary. But getting there would mean crossing 30 yards of open ground under fire from a dozen armed men. "Can you handle a rifle?" he asked, pulling his father's old hunting rifle from its rack. "Well enough," Nora replied, checking the weapon's action, with hands that were steady despite the chaos erupting around them. "I'm a better shot than Thomas gave me credit for." They moved Lucy to the root cellar, the child's eyes wide with fear, but trusting in the adults who had become her world. "Stay down there no matter what you hear," Nora told her firmly. "We'll come back for you when it's safe. I promise." "I love you, Mama," Lucy whispered, using the name that had gradually become natural over the winter months. "I love you too, sweetheart. More than you'll ever know." With Lucy safely hidden, Elias and Nora prepared for the desperate dash to the barn. Outside, the mob had reorganized after the initial shock of resistance, and their leader was shouting orders about surrounding the house and preventing escape. "Ready?" Elias asked, positioning himself at the back door while Nora covered the windows. "Ready," she confirmed, though her heart was hammering against her ribs. They burst through the door together, running in a weaving pattern that made them harder. Targets as bullets whined through the air around them. Nora heard the distinctive crack of rifle fire and felt something tug at her skirt, but she kept running, focused on the barn door that seemed impossibly far away. A lantern smashed against the barn wall beside her head, showering her with glass and oil that she quickly beat away from her clothes. Elias reached the door first, yanking it open and providing covering fire as she dove through into the relative safety of the stone and timber structure. "We made it," she gasped, checking herself for wounds and finding only minor cuts from the flying glass. "First part, anyway," Elias replied grimly, already moving to barricade the door. "Now we find out how badly they want us dead." Outside, the mob's fury had reached a crescendo. The unsuccessful rush had cost them the element of surprise and revealed that their targets were better prepared than expected, but it had also committed them to a course of action that could only end in victory or complete defeat. The lanterns that had announced their arrival now served a different purpose, casting light that revealed the barn as a fortress that would be much harder to take than the house had been. For the first time since beginning their attack, some of the riders began to question whether they had bitten off more than they could chew. But their leader, drunk on righteousness and the momentum of violence, was already planning the next assault. The siege of the barn had lasted nearly an hour when the sound of approaching hoofbeats from the east changed everything. At first, both the defenders and attackers assumed it was reinforcements for the mob, but as the new riders drew closer, their disciplined formation and the gleam of a badge in the lantern light revealed a very different truth. Sheriff Williams had arrived with a proper posse, 6 deputized men who had been roused from their beds when word of the vigilante action reached town. Behind them rode Pastor Garrett and several other community leaders who had chosen to stand on the side of law rather than mob justice. "This ends now!" The sheriff's voice boomed across the yard as his men spread out to surround the attackers. "Throw down your weapons and disperse, or face charges of arson, attempted murder, and disturbing the peace." The mob leader, his face finally revealed as that of Marcus Webb, a failed rancher who had been nursing grievances against more successful neighbors for years, spurred his horse toward the sheriff with desperate bravado. "You don't understand the situation, Williams," he shouted. "That woman in there is an abomination, a curse that's already infected one good man and his child. We're doing God's work here. What you're doing is breaking the law." Sheriff Williams replied firmly, his own weapon drawn and pointed at Webb's chest, "and threatening the lives of innocent people based on superstition and mob hysteria." From inside the barn, Nora felt a surge of hope so powerful it nearly brought her to her knees. After months of hiding, weeks of fear, and an hour of terror, the law had finally arrived to stand between them and those who would destroy them. "Sheriff," she called out through the barn door, "we're alive and unharmed, but they've been trying to burn us out." "I can see that, ma'am," Williams replied, his eyes taking in the scattered torches and the scorch marks on the barn walls. "Mr. Boone, are you and your family secure in there?" "We are now," Elias answered, though he kept his shotgun ready. Mobs could turn unpredictable when cornered, and he wouldn't relax until every last attacker had been disarmed. Pastor Garrett urged his horse forward, his face grave with disappointment as he surveyed the scene. "Marcus Webb, I'm ashamed of you and every man who rode with you tonight. This is not how Christian people resolve their differences." "Christian people?" Webb spat. "That woman crawled out of her own grave, Pastor. Tell me that's natural. Tell me that's not the work of something unholy. What's unholy is attempting to murder someone based on fear and ignorance," Pastor Garrett replied with rare anger. "Nora Wren is a victim of terrible crimes, not the perpetrator of them. And even if she were everything you claim, vigilante, justice is not our way." The confrontation might have continued indefinitely, with Webb and his followers too proud to back down and too outnumbered to fight, but it was resolved by an unexpected intervention. Lucy Boone emerged from the house, having climbed out of the root cellar when she heard familiar voices, and walked steadily across the yard toward the armed men. "You're scaring my mama," she said, with the fearless clarity that only children could manage in moments of adult madness. "And my papa, and me, why are you trying to hurt us?" The sight of the 8-year-old girl, small and brave and completely innocent of whatever sins the mob had convinced themselves they were fighting, deflated the remaining fight out of most of the attackers. Several actually lowered their weapons, shamefaced at being confronted with the human cost of their actions. "Lucy, honey, go back to the house," Elias called out, his heart in his throat at seeing his daughter exposed to such danger. "It's all right, Papa," she replied with surprising calm. "These men are going to go home now, aren't you?" She looked directly at Marcus Webb as she said it, her clear blue eyes holding no accusation, only the expectation that adults would behave better than they had been. Webb stared down at the child for a long moment, and something in his expression, cracked. The righteous fury that had sustained him through the night seemed to drain away, leaving only a tired, bitter man who had nearly committed unforgivable acts in the name of a cause that looked increasingly hollow. "This isn't over," he muttered, but there was no conviction in his voice. "Yes, it is," Sheriff Williams said firmly. "Marcus Webb, you're under arrest for inciting a riot, attempted arson, and conspiracy to commit murder. The rest of you, I want names, and I want them now. Anyone who cooperates fully will be charged with disturbing the peace. Anyone who doesn't will face the same charges as Webb." The mass surrender that followed was almost anticlimactic. Faced with the choice between admitting their participation in the night's events or facing serious felony charges, most of the mob chose the lesser punishment. Within 30 minutes, the yard was clear except for the sheriff's men and the community leaders who had come to restore order. Nora emerged from the barn on unsteady legs, the rifle still clutched in her hands but no longer needed for defense. The relief of survival was overwhelming, but so was the anger at what they had endured, the knowledge that neighbors and supposed Christians had been willing to murder them based on nothing more than gossip and superstition. "Mrs. Wren, Sheriff," Williams said, approaching with his hat in his hands, "I owe you and Mr. Boone an apology. This should never have been allowed to happen." "How did you know to come?" she asked. "Hendrick from the general store. He overheard Webb and his friends planning this attack and rode straight to me. Said he might not understand everything that had happened, but he knew vigilante justice when he saw it brewing." The irony was not lost on any of them that Nora's salvation had come from one of the same townspeople she'd been afraid would betray her location. Perhaps the community was more complex than any of them had realized, containing both those who would destroy and those who would protect. Pastor Garrett dismounted and approached the small family group, his expression heavy with sorrow for what his community had revealed about itself. "Mrs. Wren, Mr. Boone, I cannot begin to express how ashamed I am of what happened here tonight. This is not who we are supposed to be. With respect, Pastor, Nora replied quietly. "I think this is exactly who some of you are. Tonight just brought it into the open. Perhaps you're right, but I hope you'll also see that others chose differently. Henrik could have stayed silent. The sheriff could have waited until morning. I could have stayed home and let events unfold without intervention. We didn't." Elias stepped closer to Nora, slipping his arm around her waist in a gesture that was both protective and defiant. "What happens now? Webb and his friends might be facing charges, but the attitudes that drove them haven't changed." "No, they haven't," Sheriff Williams agreed, "which is why I'm recommending that you both consider my offer of official protection until this situation fully resolves itself. And Pastor Garrett has a suggestion that might help with the broader community concerns." Pastor Garrett cleared his throat, obviously uncomfortable with what he was about to propose. "There's been talk, unfair talk, about the propriety of your living arrangements. People who might otherwise be sympathetic to your situation have been influenced by suggestions that, well, that moral standards have been compromised. Suggestions made by people like Thomas Wren and Marcus Webb," Nora said bitterly. "Yes, but the truth is, perception matters in a small community, and if we're going to rebuild trust and acceptance, we need to address those perceptions directly." Elias understood where this was heading. "You're suggesting we get married?" "I'm suggesting that if you were planning to marry anyway, and I can see that you care deeply for each other, doing so publicly and officially might help heal some of the divisions in this community." It wasn't the most romantic proposal circumstances, but as Nora looked around at the scorched barn walls, the trampled yard, and the evidence of how close they had come to losing everything, she realized that romance was less important than security. They had already committed themselves to each other in every way that mattered. Making it legal and public would protect them from future attacks based on moral judgment. "Yes," she said simply, looking into Elias's eyes, "if you'll have me as your wife, Elias Boone, I'd be honored to marry you." "The honor would be mine," he replied, and when they kissed there in the firelight, witnessed by the sheriff, the pastor, and the slowly brightening eastern sky, it felt like the true ending of the nightmare that had begun in a shallow grave so many months ago. The community would talk, of course. There would be those who never accepted Nora's presence or forgave Elias for protecting her, but there would also be others, like Henrik and the pastor and the sheriff, who chose justice over prejudice, law over mob rule, and compassion over fear. As the last of the lanterns was extinguished and the first light of dawn touched the prairie, 3 people who had been tested by fire emerged stronger for the experience, ready to face whatever future awaited them as a family united by choice, sealed by law, and protected by those who understood that sometimes the greatest courage was found in defending the right of others to exist, to love, and to live free from the shadows of other people's fears. 6 months later, on a crisp October morning that mirrored the day when everything had begun, Nora stood in the kitchen of what was now officially her home, watching through the window as Elias and Lucy worked together to repair the last section of fence damaged in the spring roundup. The simple gold band on her finger caught the sunlight, not the twisted, dirt-stained ring that had once symbolized a marriage built on duty and disappointment, but a new ring that Elias had crafted himself from metal he'd traded for at the general store. The wedding had taken place 3 weeks after the night of the attack, conducted by Pastor Garrett in the same church where Nora's memorial service had been held the previous fall. The irony of the location wasn't lost on anyone present, but it had seemed important to reclaim that space for something joyful rather than leaving it haunted by the memory of false grief. Half the community had attended, which was more support than any of them had expected given the circumstances. Henrik, from the general store, had stood as Elias's witness, while Mrs. Patterson, the schoolteacher who had defended Lucy against whispers about her unconventional upbringing, had served as Nora's. The service itself had been simple and heartfelt, focused on the promises being made rather than the elaborate rituals that often obscured the true meaning of marriage. The inheritance money had transformed their practical circumstances in ways both large and small. The ranch now boasted new equipment, expanded livestock herds, and improvements that would have taken decades to afford on their previous income. But more importantly, it had provided the security and independence that allowed them to weather community disapproval without fear of economic ruin. Not everyone had accepted their marriage gracefully. Thomas Wren, serving a 10-year sentence for attempted murder, had made futile legal challenges to Nora's inheritance claim from his prison cell. Marcus Webb and several of his co-conspirators had left the territory entirely after serving brief jail sentences, unwilling to face the ongoing shame of their failed vigilante action. A few families continued to treat the Boones with cold politeness that barely concealed their disapproval. But for every neighbor who remained hostile, another had eventually come around to accepting the reality of their situation. Mrs. Henderson, at the general store, had gradually warmed to Nora after witnessing her consistent kindness and practical competence. Dr. Whitman had become a regular visitor after Lucy's bout with winter fever, developing a professional respect for Nora's nursing skills that had evolved into genuine friendship. Even some of the church families had begun including them in social gatherings, tentatively at first, but with growing acceptance as time proved their fears unfounded. The most significant change had come in Lucy herself. The little girl who had once been motherless and isolated had blossomed into a confident, happy child who moved easily between her father's practical lessons and her stepmother's instruction in the domestic arts that would serve her well as she grew older. She had started calling Nora Mama without any prompting, and the title had stuck with the natural ease of something that had always been meant to be. "Mama, look what I found!" Lucy's voice carried across the yard as she ran toward the house, her hands cupped around some small treasure. At 9 years old, she had grown taller and more confident, but she still possessed the curiosity and enthusiasm that made every day an adventure. "What is it, sweetheart?" Nora asked, wiping her hands on her apron as she stepped out onto the porch. "A baby bird that fell from its nest. Papa says we can try to help it if we're very careful." Nora examined the tiny creature nestled in Lucy's palms, a fledgling meadowlark with soft grey feathers and bright, frightened eyes. It was injured but alive, much like she had been when Elias first found her clawing her way out of her own grave. "We'll make a soft nest for it in a basket," she decided, "and see if we can get it strong enough to fly again." As they worked together to create a safe space for the injured bird, Nora reflected on the strange turns that life could take. A year ago, she had been buried alive, written off as dead by people who found her existence inconvenient. Now she was a wife, a mother, and a woman with the financial independence to make her own choices about how to live and whom to love. The legal resolution of Thomas's crimes had brought a certain closure, but the real healing had come through the daily acts of building a life together. Every morning she woke up next to a man who valued her thoughts and opinions. Every afternoon she spent teaching Lucy skills that would serve her throughout her life. Every evening she participated in conversations that treated her as an equal partner rather than a burden to be tolerated. Elias finished his work with the fence and walked toward the house, his step lighter than it had been in the years since Sarah's death. The guilt and loneliness that had haunted him for so long had gradually been replaced by contentment and purpose. He had not forgotten his first wife. Her memory would always be precious to him, but he had learned that the heart could expand, to hold new love without diminishing what had come before. "How's our patient?" he asked, examining the small bird that was already showing signs of responding to their care. "Stronger than she looks," Nora replied with a smile that held deeper. "Meaning? Sometimes the things that seem most fragile turn out to be the most resilient." As evening approached, they gathered around the dinner table as they had countless times before, but tonight felt different somehow. Perhaps it was the changing season. which brought memories of the darkness they had survived together. Perhaps it was the simple pleasure of sharing a meal prepared in their own kitchen, served on plates they had chosen together, eaten in the company of people who had become family by choice rather than accident of birth. "Mrs. Patterson says I'm ready to help teach the younger children their letters," Lucy announced, between bites of fresh bread. "She thinks I have a natural gift for explaining things." "That doesn't surprise me," Nora said warmly. "You've always been good at seeing what people need and finding ways to help them get it, like how you and Papa needed each other," Lucy observed with the straightforward wisdom that children sometimes possessed. "Even before you knew it yourselves." The comment drew laughter from both adults, but it also carried truth that none of them could deny. They had found each other at a time when each was struggling with loss and isolation, and together they had built something stronger than any of them could have achieved alone. As night settled over the ranch and Lucy was tucked into bed with her wooden doll and a story about brave princesses who saved themselves, Nora and Elias sat together on the front porch, watching the stars emerge in the clear prairie sky. The same stars had shone down on the night when she'd clawed her way from her grave, and on all the nights of fear and uncertainty that had followed. But now they seemed to shine with blessing rather than judgment, witnesses to a love that had survived every test fate could devise. "Any regrets?" Elias asked, taking her hand in his calloused fingers. "About what?" "All of it. The way we met, the scandal, the difficulties we've faced. Do you ever wish you'd taken that inheritance money and started fresh somewhere else? Away from all the complications?" Nora considered the question seriously, as she always did when he asked something important. The money would indeed have allowed her to go anywhere, to reinvent herself completely in a place where no one knew her history. She could have been anyone she chose to be, free from the whispers and judgments that still occasionally followed her around Millfield. "No," she said finally. "I've spent enough of my life running from things or letting other people define who I was supposed to be. This is where I choose to be, with the people I choose to love, living the life we've built together. Let them whisper. Let them judge. We know the truth of what we are." In the distance, a coyote called to its mate, the sound carrying across the prairie with wild, primitive beauty. It was answered by another voice, then another, until the night was filled with their song of connection and belonging. "Besides," Nora added with a smile that held all the warmth and mischief he'd fallen in love with, "someone has to stay here and show them that sometimes the things they try to bury have a way of growing stronger in the darkness." The new wedding ring on her finger caught the starlight as she lifted his hand to her lips, sealing with a kiss the promise they had made to each other and to the future they would continue building together. In the morning, there would be work to do, challenges to face, and a community to continue winning over one small act of kindness at a time. But tonight, there was only the peace of home, the warmth of love freely given and gratefully received, and the quiet satisfaction of knowing that they had not merely survived the worst that life could throw at them. They had transformed it into something beautiful. The woman who had once been buried for being worthless had become the foundation of a family, the heart of a home, and living proof that sometimes the most powerful act of defiance was simply refusing to stay dead when the world decided you were better off that way.